Hey, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of Our Love Story with Dyanna Eisel, my very favorite certified couples counselor. What's up, Dyanna?
Hi, how are you?
Doing awesome. How are you doing today?
Good. It's Friday.
Good. Glad to have you here as always.
Thank you. Likewise. Happy to be here.
Awesome. And of course, we are so glad to have you guys here, our audience, our beloved followers. And if you have been watching the show for quite some time, I think we're coming up on 3 years now, Dyanna? We've been doing this?
Like 2.5-ish.
Yeah, we're getting there. It's like getting toward the end of the year, and that's when we know it's a new season.
New season.
So if you've been following us for any length of time, you will know that what we typically talk about here are those issues that couples are dealing with. And then a lot of what Dyanna sees in her office. So what is kind of popular right now, or trending right now, I should say, as far as what couples are going through. And that changes, Dyanna, right? Because what our grandparents dealt with during their relationship is very different than what we're dealing with. It's a different time. It's a different atmosphere. We have different worries, different obstacles, things like that. So we go over, and with Dyanna's help, she's absolutely amazing. We go over those things. We talk through those topics so that you guys can get a little bit of extra information, maybe a little more insight on what might be happening in your relationship. Or sometimes we will pull an anonymous post because we don't like to put anybody on blast. We'll pull an anonymous post from the Mom Nation group to talk about, because that, I find a lot of times, those are trending issues that a lot of other people are dealing with too. These people just chose to speak up about it, where a lot of us, I mean, what do you find, Dyanna? A lot of us just kind of don't, right? We just kind of keep that to ourselves. We push it down. We don't talk about these things. And learning, communicating, receiving support from others, it's kind of a big deal. It's kind of an important part, right?
Absolutely. Relationships is something that we all share. It's something universal, but our expectations and our experiences can be very different. I think you would be surprised how many people actually share in some of those experiences with you. So it's always great to get some support.
Totally agree. And I like it. I mean, we all have our own things and our own issues and our own things that we need to have support about or gain some insight for or get over, right? In a healthy way. And I always appreciate and feel less alone when somebody has spoken up about what might be going on for them, especially if it resonates with me, especially if I'm like, oh yeah, me too.
Absolutely.
And so I'm glad that we're able to do that here. And if we even make one mama feel less alone, then I feel like we've done our job.
Definitely.
So today we're going to take a little bit of a different twist, and we're going to do something that we have never done before. I know, I'm excited about it too. I can't wait to hear all that you have to say. And all the things. And there apparently is, I have not seen it yet, but apparently there is a reality TV show out there that's been gaining popularity called Love is Blind.
Just a little reality show that's on its 7th season.
That's only on its 7th season. I guess I better get watching.
You've got to. There's lots of stuff going on this season.
I'm excited to talk about it, though, because before we hopped on the show, Dyanna shared with me a little bit about what's going on. And I think that it is super relevant to what is going on with couples these days and what couples really should know before they start getting into this thing we call marriage, right? Or even not marriage, but an exclusive long-term relationship.
Absolutely. Some things that you probably want to find out sooner than later before you get engaged or decide to commit to each other. There's probably some things you would want to know first.
Yeah. And Dyanna is going to tell us all about what she's been observing, especially on this last season. She said this last season is a bit of a doozy. And I love this opportunity because we look at these things with our normal people eyes, right? And having you offer your insight from your professional eyes, I think is a really big deal, and I'm excited about it. So for those of us who have not seen the show yet, and don't you know it, tonight's Friday night, so I'll be looking up Netflix. But for those of us who have not, can you tell us a little bit about what it's about?
Yes, definitely. Okay, so Love is Blind is on Netflix. It's on its 7th season. Basically, the premise of this show is to identify, is love really blind? So these contestants meet each other in these pods where there is a wall between them. They can't see each other. And they essentially date over the course of days and weeks to learn about each other, to see if they're a good match, to see if they're compatible without knowing anything about what they look like. That is the only topic that's really off limits, is talking about what they look like. So at the end of this dating period, the end goal is to get engaged without seeing the other person. And then after they're engaged, they meet in real life to see each other. They go on to like a honeymoon for a few days, and then they come back to wherever they live and they move in together, and they start meeting each other's friends and parents and seeing what it's like to live with each other. And as you probably assume, that's where a lot of the issues come up, not in the pods, but when they're actually living together. And some of the things that I've been thinking about, I've watched all the seasons, like I'm definitely a reality TV junkie myself. This season, there seemed to be a lot more blatantly obvious topics that were probably missed. And I'm hoping that going through some of these things will not only provide like our viewers or listeners with like some entertainment and some tea about this season, but also like, oh, if I'm in a new relationship, have I asked these questions? Have I thought about these things? Have we processed through some of this stuff to identify potential problems now before later? So obviously, this is reality TV. We don't get to see everything. Like the cameras are with them, but not every waking moment of every day. So there's certainly some context that's left out. There's some details that are left out. But there are definitely some takeaways from this season that just ended that I think might be helpful to some of our viewers and some of our listeners.
My first question is, when they're in the pods, are the questions or the discussions that they have scripted? Is this given to them? Like, you have to ask, like, you can ask whatever you want, but you have to ask XYZ questions, or is it just up to the couple to figure each other out?
You know, they have journals in there with them where they like take notes about each person that they're dating, that they're meeting. You know, I don't know if Netflix producers require them to ask very specific questions, but overall, it doesn't seem to be entirely scripted. However, if you know you're going on a show where you're going to be dating someone in a pod, you're probably going to have your questions like pre-formulated to try to identify like who's a good fit for you. And I think that there's a lot of effort that goes into that, into identifying like what types of questions I want to ask. And for some reason, it feels like, while this is obviously an experiment, you know what I mean? It feels like there were some big things that were missed, whether they were purposely omitted by one of them or just something I didn't really think about would be an issue that I think is kind of unique to this season. Every season has had some things, some deal breakers that have come up during the like cohabitation period. But these are pretty big ticket items. And there were also some behaviors that were going on in the pods that certainly like, you know, raise my alarm bells as to like, oh, this is not going to end well. You know what I mean? So yeah, I'm not sure if all their questions are scripted, but I'm sure the producers definitely curate some of that material for sure.
Yeah, I would imagine so. Is there a trend that you see? So do multiple couples have the same issue that could have been handled back in the pod when learning about each other? Or do the couples kind of all have, is it all over the board?
You know, that's really interesting because some of the specific issues that some of these couples were facing when they were cohabitating were pretty unique to just them and wasn't something that some of the other couples were experiencing, which I find fascinating because like, how would you know ahead of time that like all of these couples are going to have a pretty serious issue going into the relationship, but they're so different? Now, I'm not saying that these issues can't be applied to anyone like in the real world. Certainly any of these issues can be applied in a real life relationship, but these issues this season are pretty unique, pretty different. The personalities are pretty different. So I don't see a ton of similarities in the issues that are like the big ones.
So what, as a therapist,
Mm.
what stuck out to you in terms of what one of these couples is dealing with right now in this season that you were like, oh my gosh, this is the biggest dumpster fire I have ever seen?
Like, dumpster fire is literally the words that I use to describe this season. And just like, as a disclaimer, I really hope that Netflix like provides mental health professionals for these participants, because this stuff is like really heavy, and you're in front of, you know, a national audience, getting engaged for real and getting married for real, and, you know, living with someone and exposing your vulnerabilities. Like, I'm just really hoping they get the support that they need, because wow, like, there's a lot. Also, I think there's something to be said for who they're vetting and how they're vetting these contestants, because some of these people, and for those of you who have been watching, you know exactly who I'm going to be talking about first, should have been spotted like from a mile away. Like, this guy is not here for Love is Blind. Like, he's here for some other sort of priority. Who knows what it is.
Gotcha.
So high level, there are some like specific red flags that I'll just call out right off the bat. And then I want to get into some of the individuals, some of the couples themselves, and how some of those topics have affected them. The first thing that comes to my mind is differing values. So some of these couples, for example, Marissa was in the military, and she was very proud of her military background, her experience. And that was something that wasn't really talked about a whole bunch in the pause, at least from what we saw as viewers. But the partner that she ultimately chose to get engaged to, Ramses, was pretty anti-military, pretty against it completely. And so that's a big value system when you think about like political differences, patriotism differences, deep core values that eventually, if we have children, like, how the heck are we going to navigate that if we don't agree on like how we want our children to be raised? And if somebody's been in the military and is proud of that experience, like, are they going to be expected to like make that smaller and not really talk about it and not be proud of it, and not encourage their children to also, you know, take the same path if they so choose? You know what I mean? So the military issue between Marissa and Ramses was a really big thing that has to do with values. Cultural differences as well. I think that that's kind of across the board, like for everybody. But they do a pretty decent job, these couples, not talking a ton about racial, ethnicity, like differences, because again, like Love is Blind, they don't want to give like too much information about like what the person looks like. But they do talk about like kind of where they come from and what their relationship is like with their parents, and things like that. I don't think it was explored enough, differences in family dynamics, like how we want to spend time with our in-laws and family members, and like what our relationships are really like, and like what you can expect, and past experiences with previous partners with my family and things like that. I don't think that was explored a whole lot. And we saw that sort of become an issue with Marissa and Ramses as well, because her mom was, you know, she was pretty firm on how she felt about this whole experience and how she felt about him. And ultimately, I don't think he was really prepared for that. And so I think that was one of the biggest deciding factors for him to ultimately, you know, spoiler, ultimately end the relationship before the wedding. So the differing values, the cultural differences, and then finances and roles and responsibilities. So the guy that I was referring to just a minute ago, that I'm sure everyone's thinking about because he's like all over Instagram, right, is Leo. Oh, Leo. He did not miss any opportunity to talk about how much money he has and the business that he's inherited and how wealthy his parents were before they passed away and how much money he's gotten from that. Like, he did not miss an opportunity to talk about that. But then on the other side, he was saying, I really want to find a partner that like loves me for me and not for my money. And I was just like, well, what exactly are you here for? Because it doesn't seem like your words are lining up with what you really want.
Well, he's presenting that as his identity.
Yes. Yes. And trying to downplay it so that it doesn't
Right.
seem like, oh, it's not a big deal, but like, oh, hey, I'm like wearing a Rolex sort of thing. You know what I mean? So not very demure or very mindful of him to do that. So I think that he certainly had a goal in mind. I'm not sure what that was, but certainly wasn't the best. So we saw sort of the financial issue come up there, especially with who he chose, which was Brittany. They didn't even make it any further past like the engagement. They ultimately broke it off. But I think why they chose each other was I think she was kind of looking for that. I don't know. I don't know who she is as a person. But she did make statements like, I normally date rock stars and athletes, and rock stars and athletes have a lot of money, you know, and she presented herself as someone who prefers to be taken care of in relationships and not to have a lot of financial responsibility. So, you know, that was sort of an attractive quality to her that he had that.
Right.
But he did not appear to be wanting that as well. Like, I think he wanted like someone who was just going to like fawn all over him, you know what I mean? And maybe not someone that he had to like take care of, but someone that was just going to like take care of him, maybe not financially, but like just adore him, you know what I mean? But he wasn't presenting with any like, these are the things that I have to contribute as a human being. Like, these are my qualities and things that you should love about me as a human being. It was just really about the money. So we saw that with Leo and Brittany, but then we also saw it with Nick and Hannah, who ultimately did get engaged, but they didn't make it all the way to the altar. So there's another spoiler for you. Nick was living at home in his parents' basement, and his parents pretty much paid all of his bills for him. He wasn't very knowledgeable on like, you know, adulty type money stuff, 401ks and stocks and things like that. So he really didn't have a whole lot of knowledge about that. And I feel like that was something that could definitely been talked about in the pods, about like, how like literate are you with money, and like what is your comfort level with money? And we don't need to know how much each other makes, obviously, but like, you know, do you feel like stable and secure? What's your relationship with money? You know what I mean? That's a big one that we've talked about even in previous episodes about other couples, is like, what does money mean to you? You know what I mean? Is it security? Is it power? Is it contribution? Like, what does money mean to you? I think would have been a really, really good conversation to have, especially between Nick and Hannah, because it certainly became a problem later. And on Hannah's end, she is definitely more financially literate. She seems more independent, more taking care of her own stuff. However, I think that was one of the areas in the relationship she used against him as a way to create contempt. She definitely presented herself as like, I'm better than you, even though she never said those words. But she said the words like, I made you from a boy into a man in a matter of weeks of knowing each other. I mean, total sidebar there, but that would be a really interesting, you know, conversation to have with her from an attachment lens of like, what are you experiencing? Like, what have you experienced that is making you want to not only choose partners similar to this, but also like, what are you getting out of making the other person feel so small and so insignificant in this relationship? Like creating that
emasculate him.
Totally. I think like most people can agree that have watched it is like, oh man, poor Nick. You know what I mean? Like, he certainly, you know, wouldn't be everyone's choice as a partner, but he certainly didn't deserve the way that he was being treated in that relationship at all. So we saw finances show up for them in their relationship too.
Do you think, just real quick, and I haven't seen it, but do you think he's attracted to that because that is kind of like mom?
Yeah, I think there was definitely some value that he got out of having that type of relationship with someone who basically had their proverbial shit together. You know what I mean? I think he found a lot of value in that, but I think that a gentler approach to that would have definitely landed a lot differently, of like trying to like help him and educate him to be his own independent person, you know what I mean? And to not like depend on her, not to have her role and responsibility in the relationship to take over all of those things, but like, let me show you some of the things that I've learned as an adult on how to handle some of these like financial things, you know what I mean? But she was not interested in doing that. She was definitely interested in identifying all the differences that were between them and how significantly advanced she was compared to him in that area. So it was definitely a roles and responsibilities thing that could have been addressed earlier as well. Definitely in a more supportive way too.
Yeah, absolutely. So,
Yeah.
I mean, I'm sold. Like I told you at the beginning of the show that I'm going to be sitting down with Netflix tonight, and I totally am, because now I need to see how this all unfolded and how it went from what seems like interest and bliss to real quick, not so much.
Yeah, real life issues. Children. Everyone saw that one of the participants had kids that he donated sperm to somebody that he knew to have children, and ultimately they did make it to the altar, and they were actually the ones that I was predicting was going to be the most likely to make it. But that's definitely something you should talk about ahead of time. Like,
you think so?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that even if it was anonymous, right? In this case, it wasn't. Like, it wasn't an anonymous person. But even in the case, like, if you were to, donate sperm through a bank or whatever, like, there are certainly situations where people find like who, their biological parent is and might want to seek them out someday. And, 25 years down the line, if your partner has no idea that you participated in that and that you donated in that way, and this person just like shows up or calls, like, I could see how that would feel like a massive betrayal, that like you made these choices when you were younger, and that's fine. There's nothing wrong with it. And that's ultimately like what Ashley said, was like, it's fine that you did that, but like, that would have been really nice to know that biologically you have other children out there. You know what I mean? For some people, it might not be any big deal, but I do think that it's information worth talking about. You know what I mean?
I'm going to push on this just a little bit, because and not that I disagree with you. I totally agree. I totally feel like big deals should come out. But when we all have different perspectives, what is a big deal to you might not be a big deal to me. And let's just say how much stuff do you tell to the other person? Like, how deep do you go? And what if it's things that you just don't remember or aren't coming to the surface as something that could come up in the future, just like you described? Yeah. When you first said it, he donated sperm and, whatever, I was thinking to myself, well, okay. But then I didn't put that further thought into thinking in the future that human might want to seek out that connection, which if I was that human, I totally would want to know. Whether I had a relationship with that parent or not, I would want to know where I come from. I think that that's a totally normal human want, in that space. But like, how do we determine what those important things are? Because I might feel like that was I just did it to help out the greater good of some family that couldn't do it. Didn't even think it could come back in my life at some point. But now the person that I'm with is having some big feelings about it. How do you do that?
Yeah, I think that's totally valid. And that's where the subjectivity comes in, right? Because some things that are important to you might not be important to someone else. You know what I mean? In this case, like with him, providing that for someone that like he knew, like, I feel like, what was his why in doing that, right? Like, I think there's a difference between like, if my why is to contribute in this way for like, for money, right? Because you need it, or because you just feel like that's something that like you want to contribute to the planet, of having like, your DNA running around somewhere, you know what I mean? But like, for some people that might be like, that's really powerful. Like, you provided a means for someone who otherwise would not have been able to have a child, like change their life forever by bringing another life into the world. And I don't think that's anything to be ashamed of. And I don't think that he should feel bad about it. For me, it's the opposite. Like, that's something that I feel like he should be very proud that he did. You know what I mean? And if she does feel some sort of way about it and has an issue with it, then like that's something that she can certainly process on her own and determine like what the future of that relationship will look like. But I feel like that's a big deal. You know what I mean? Like, just like if, you know, for the opposite, for like a woman, right? Like if you donated eggs, or like if you were a surrogate, you helped someone have life, you know, build their family, like that's amazing. Like that says a lot about a person who would do that, would sacrifice their body and go through treatments and go through invasive procedures to give somebody else the opportunity to have a baby. You know what I mean? Like that's something to be very proud of. And I don't think it should have been disclosed as like oh, hey, by the way, like I also donated sperm to a friend or whatever. But like there was a time where I felt like this is what I needed to do to like help them achieve, you know, building a family and like live their dream. And like, I feel proud that like I was a part of that experience. You know what I mean? That says a lot about a person they would do that. And that's why I feel it's so important that if that is something like that should be talked about, that should be disclosed. And however the other person feels about it is up to them, right? Like it's up to them how they feel about it, what they do with that information, whatever. But I don't think that's something that should be withheld. It's very vulnerable. But I think that that's something important.
Do you think that, and I know what your answer is going to be, but I'm going to ask it anyway. Do you think that it's important for each partner to write down, journal, whatever, the things that are important to them?
Sure.
Like when they're learning about another person, to ask. So then that way, the other person doesn't not give information that potential spouse or potential partner would need just because they don't think of it.
Sure. Like I like to call those deal breakers. Like these are big ticket items that could change potentially the trajectory of this relationship if there is going to be one. One of the questions that almost every single participant in those pods ask is, do you have kids? Because you want to know if that person's a parent. And there's been other parents on Love is Blind before, and it wasn't like an issue, right? But like that's important. Do you already have kids? You know what I mean? Like if he had 3 kids that were living with him that he was supporting, or had 50-50 or whatever, like it'd be a no-brainer. He'd say, yeah, I have 3 kids. You know what I mean? But to, in the same breath, not think about like, well, technically, I don't have custody over these kids. Like I don't have guardianship of these kids, but like they are like biologically my kids. So here's a story for you. You know what I mean? And sharing it that way, I feel like that's not a huge leap from, do you have kids? You know?
Totally agree. So my term that I'm going to use might not be the right term here, but in other words, it's kind of not on the other partner or spouse necessarily to regurgitate all of the information about themselves. It's kind of on you too, in a sense, to share what your deal breakers are and what is most important to you, right? Like we can't put all that weight on the other partner and be like, oh, well, you never told me X, Y, Z. Well, you never asked.
Totally. Absolutely. I think there's plenty of things that couples don't know about each other right off the bat because they didn't think it was important or think that it had held any weight in the relationship. You know what I mean? I think that's a balance. You have your deal breakers that you need to ask, but then there's also like a healthy level of disclosure of like, you know, I don't know. I can't think of something that's not incredibly extreme right now, but that you would probably want to disclose to someone that you were entertaining spending the rest of your life with. You know what I mean? went to prison for 10 years for, manslaughter. Probably something you want to know. You know what I mean? Like, even if you don't know the circumstances, like, it should probably know that about you. You know what I mean? Obviously an extreme example, right? But so I think it's on both people. One person to identify like what those red flags are. But if the other person thinks that, oh, this is an important bit of information, but I'm going to purposely withhold it, I don't think that's right either. You know what I mean? If you think it would mean something to that other person and you purposely withhold it, I don't think that's right either.
Yeah. How do you feel? And this could be a totally other topic. And I know we're over time at this point. This is a cool topic.
So fun.
But how do you feel about disclosing details of past relationships?
I think that really depends on everyone's comfort level.
Okay. Because I feel like that can get a little like, okay, that was then, this is now.
Yeah.
I don't know. That feels like a little icky to me, depending on how deep it is. Yeah. So for instance, when I first started seeing my now husband, I shared right up front, yes, I was married before. Okay. Not a secret. It's out on the table. But I didn't go deep into the details of that relationship. I feel like that's kind of not relevant.
No, I don't think it's entirely relevant either, but everything's subjective, right? So like if your partner now is like, okay, like how did the relationship end? Or like, what was there a theme that you noticed? Or sure, if you want to ask those questions, fine. But I don't think that that's something that the other person is like required to disclose right off the bat, right? Like, I don't think past relationships should dictate or define who a person is now, because at the end of the day, you're still only getting one side of that anyway.
Right.
You know what I mean? So it is what it is. It shouldn't define how your relationship is going to be either. You know what I mean? I think the time that, like, one thing that I can think of that would make it important is like, if you were in a relationship before and, you were cheated on, there was an infidelity, right? And there's obviously an attachment injury there. It's good to know because like there might be times if we're in a conflict and you're feeling, insecure or questioning what I'm doing or something like that. And I will give that a little bit more grace, I think, than I would if I had no idea, like I had no context. You know what I mean? Because knowing there's like some trauma there related to that. You know what I mean? I think that's helpful to know, not like every little nitty gritty detail of your relationship, but like, yeah, I do feel hurt. I do feel like I'm still healing from, infidelity or whatever. Like, I think that could only help your next partner, like understand more about like behaviors and conflicts and things like that. And like take the opportunity to build that trust with them differently, What
if you were the cheater?
Do I think that they should disclose that?
Yeah.
I don't think it's required, but I feel like if it's a serial situation, this is actually something that came up in the pods too, that they have cheated on partners in the past. Like, again, like, should you be held responsible for every indiscretion and every decision that you've ever made in the past? Like, if you have injury from being cheated on, that might be a red flag for you. If you decide that I can never be in a relationship with someone who's ever been unfaithful to their partners, well, like, I mean, that's your decision. You know what I mean? But people make decisions for all kinds of different reasons. You know what I mean?
So true. So moral of the story, really like put your homework into this, guys. This is a big deal. This is your life. This is your future. And honestly, like unraveling it is awful and nobody wants to go through that and nobody wants to end things. I don't think, obviously if there's a reason to end it, but nobody goes into, I should say, a relationship thinking, this is, if they're thinking long-term marriage, that kind of thing, like nobody's really thinking of exiting it, right? And exiting it is hard. I went through it. It's huge and it's impactful and it's so emotionally draining and physically draining and financially draining. Like avoid that.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And be honest with yourself and what you feel like you can live with and what you feel like you can sacrifice or sit with for the rest of that relationship, knowing what your intentions and your motivations are, which, on Love is Blind, like they have a lot of other external factors that motivate them. For some people, it could be more TV time. For more people, it can be, the honeymoon that they get to go on in Mexico or whatever, having this big, beautiful, lavish wedding and going dress shopping. And there's all these other things, you know what I mean, that might keep these particular people in a relationship longer than in real life. It's a different sort of motivating factor there, right? But in real life, if you identify what those deal breakers are, you either have to choose to accept those things or move on.
Yeah. And it's a lot easier and less emotionally, physically, mentally impactful to do that on the onset versus, 5, 10, 15 years in.
Absolutely. And they don't get that opportunity on the show, right? They only get a few weeks.
Right.
Yep.
Awesome. Well, this was so good and so entertaining. And thank you for doing this. And thank you for sharing this conversation with me. I know that in the past, we have touched on those conversations to have in the beginning of a relationship. And I love that we actually have something that we can all watch that sort of shows us why that's important, right?
Absolutely. Go enjoy the dumpster fire if you haven't already.
And I will tonight. And I'll be thinking of you while I do it.
Awesome. Can't wait.
Thank you again, Dyanna. And for all of you that want to check out any of our previous episodes, I will actually link the episode that I'm talking about conversations to have before you start really getting serious about somebody. I'll link that so that way you guys can catch that as well. If you want to check out any of our previous episodes, at Mom Nation USA is our handle. We are on YouTube. It is all beautifully laid out in a lovely little playlist there. Just scroll down a little bit on the homepage and you will see what we call OLS, which stands for Our Love Story Q&A for couples. If you prefer the podcast style, maybe you run, bike, hike a lot, then over on your favorite podcast platform, do a search for Mom Nation Talk Radio. There you will find us, download, notify, all the things. Rate us, please. I saw a few new ratings the other day and I was really excited about that. So thank you guys for following us, listening to us, supporting us. We hope that this is just as helpful for you as it is enjoyable for us. So thank you again.
Thank you.